Well, welcome everybody who have joined us for this Emerging Scholars Network conversation with Josh McNall. My name is Bob Truby, and I serve as the director of the Emerging Scholars Network. I don't know about you, but I find myself deeply troubled by the deep divides in our society, but even more in kind of the tone of the division. Either I encounter a kind of very shrill certainty or sheer cynicism in much of the discourse. And where I long for real conversation to explore ideas, oftentimes there's only vitriol and snark. And it's very difficult. My conversation partner today might not be able to solve all the things of our toxic national discourse, but his book suggests that there is a third option to unbending doubt and inflexible dogmatism. And before we begin with my conversation with Josh McNall, we'll take care of just a couple of housekeeping details. Okay. First of all, I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. We will be recording the conversation. And if you prefer not to be recorded or photographed, please keep your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the ESN conversation with your video and or audio enabled after the recording begins, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes, including posting a video recording online for asynchronous viewing. I'm going to stop our recording now to allow you to disable your video if you prefer not to be recorded. Just a brief introduction of Josh. There's a picture of him, and you'll see him here more in a moment. He is the Associate Professor of Pastoral Theology, an ambassador of church relations, and also the director of the honors program at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. We were talking just before the conversation started here that he's just getting ready for a new year like many of you are. He's the author of several books: The Mosaic of Atonement, An Integrated Approach to Christ's Work, Long Story Short, The Bible in 6 Movements, and A Free Corrector, Colin Gunton and the Legacy of Augustine. That one sounds interesting to me, actually. He also hosts a podcast called Outpost Theology, and I've put the link in there for you, and you can find that at Apple iTunes, I believe. And so with that, I'm going to end share screen, and we'll talk. Josh and I will have some conversation together. Okay, Josh, I wonder if we could start by just inviting you to take some time and talk a little bit about how you came to write the book.
Well, sure. First, Bob, I want to say thanks for having me on, and thanks for everybody for taking time to be a part of the conversation. Every book comes from somewhere, maybe more than one place in certain ways. But as Bob mentioned at the outset, one of the reasons or one of the places that it came from was just an observation about where my students are and where our culture is in this increasingly divided time. And specifically where the church is, where I've, just as a professor and as a pastor, witnessed so many of my students seemingly sort of sliding towards the land of doubt and deconstruction. And we've heard the common usage of the label of the nuns, folks who were formerly affiliated with some theological or spiritual tradition, but now don't claim it. And so the slide towards pervasive doubt, and then also the slide towards this sort of strident or angry dogmatism as a reaction sometimes to the doubters or to secularism or to different facets of our culture. And it seemed to me that neither one of these options or postures best characterize the life of faith. And that there needed to be some space carved out for those sort of in between those two extremes. And that was really the genesis of the book.
Well, yeah, I resonated with that. I've seen some of the same kind of phenomenon and the reaction against the dogmatism and the movement toward nuns and leaving institutional expressions of Christianity, or even leaving the faith altogether as a result of that. Will you describe, perhaps, the title of your book, as occupying a space between doubt and dogmatism? Could you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Sure. Yeah, the book has an epigraph by N.T. Wright, and the quote from his massive 2-volume book on Paul and the faithfulness of God is, he says that sometimes believing in providence means learning how to say perhaps. And that one, sort of simple word, perhaps, it seems to me it's both humble but also bold, because it is sort of venturing forth a speculation, a sort of what if, but not with a tone or a posture of certitude. It's saying this could very well be wrong. And so one of the things that the book is doing, and even that word is doing, is trying to explore what is the place of speculation in theology. And speculation, to call somebody's work speculative, is almost never a compliment. It becomes a kind of shame word in theological discourse, going back a long ways. But one of the things I noticed is, even though it was almost always a negative term, various theologians, what they mean by speculation differs a fair bit. And I kind of explore that in the introduction. And so one of the things I'm doing with this title of Perhaps is trying to ask, well, what is the place for a kind of faithful yet sort of humble speculation within theology that doesn't devolve into the various problems that speculations can sort of spawn? And that's really the meaning of the title. Perhaps it contains a lot, maybe within that one little word.
Yeah. Well, you kind of got into my next question here, and you talk about speculation, and you're right. There's a lot of apprehension about speculation that I find in many circles. That usually speculative equals off the rails, as it were. And it was interesting in your book. You used Origen as an example of perhapsing. And he had some brilliant ideas and some things that were really kind of offbeat as well. And I wonder, what does the holy speculation that you talk about look like? And how do you guard against the going off the rails or off the cliff as you do so?
Well, I have a whole chapter on, I talk about guardrails to sacred speculation. And I also have a chapter, as you mentioned, that looks at some historical exemplars of speculation in theology. Origen is one, alongside of Julian of Norwich, and also alongside of Jonathan Edwards. And I notice, positive and negative sort of results in all three of those exemplars. But when I talk about sacred speculation in a positive way, there's really two usages to which I try to put that word, perhaps, or sacred speculation. And the first of which is to gesture towards, or to move towards, orthodox Christian truth by virtue of saying, well, what if we're going to arrive at an orthodox conclusion, how might that work in order to get there? And so it's a speculation that's rooted in Scripture and reaching forward towards Christian orthodoxy, rather than reaching out into the sort of unknown of just sort of heretical speculation, or sort of inconsequential things. So the first posture of perhaps is to rooted in Scripture, stretching forth towards Christian truth. And that's especially important for those who are wrestling with the big questions of the faith, and wrestling with doubt, and how can they remain in the fold, so to speak, of Christian orthodoxy. That's the first posture, the first application of it. The second one is to reach, or to sort of reach forward towards what I call adiaphora, or the matters of indifference with respect to orthodoxy, but they can still be important issues if we're going to try to understand the world that God has made, or how different parts of the scriptures fit together. And so I don't have the chart. I actually don't even have a copy of the book yet, I don't have my copy yet. There's a chart that kind of shows those two different applications of sacred speculation that the book is really sort of trying to model in certain ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things you talk about is this sense of that it seems like in your mind, dogmatism and the longing for certainty seem to be pretty closely associated.
Mhm.
And I suspect many of us in academia are somewhat repulsed by that, because we live with uncertainty all the time and we're constantly asking questions. But we don't go in for wishy-washy equivocation either. And how is perhaps indifferent than either of those things?
Mhm. Yeah, I think I define dogmatism in kind of two ways. It's, first of all, it's a matter of tone. So it tends towards the sort of shrill or arrogant, um, polemicizing sometimes of our opponents. So it's a matter of tone, first of all. And then secondly, it's a matter of emphasis. And the emphasis, I would say, is this sort of false certitude in areas where we ought to maybe hold certain views more loosely or with a little bit more humility. And so that's the first extreme that I talk about in terms of dogmatism. So it does have to do with
Mhm.
claims to certainty, but it also has to do with how we express those claims in our tone and our discourse. The other extreme that I deal with is the extreme of kind of crippling doubt or pervasive skepticism.
Mhm.
And I'm not making the argument that doubt is always bad. And I'm also not making the argument that doubt is always avoidable in the Christian life. And so when I locate perhaps between those two extremes, I'm not smearing all uh, doubt any more than I'm claiming that we can't have assurance of certain things. But there is a certain form of doubt or deconstruction that I think is crippling and problematic, and that's why Scripture often speaks against a certain kind of doubt and the divided heart. So I think in between those two extremes is really the life of faith. And so one of the questions that I deal with early on is, well, why don't you just call it faith? Why are we talking about perhaps? And in some ways, I think faith is an act of the will. It's an allegiance, right? Whereas perhaps is focusing more on the imagination. And so the imagination, I think, can be crucial in the life of faith as we seek to
Mhm.
live faithfully between these two extremes. And it's been overlooked sometimes in our apologetics that have focused a little bit more on rationality and things like that, and a little less on the affective or the imaginative life of the Christian. And so that's why I'm focusing on perhaps as kind of in between those two extremes.
Yeah, I like that. I- As you talk about doubt, you work with students, and I'm sure you see students in your office who have come from maybe strong Christian backgrounds, who are really wrestling with doubts, uh, or asking hard questions. How do you approach that with them?
Mhm. I think probably others on this call are professors as well, or pastors perhaps. I think maybe even before we approach it with them, it's to be a kind of person that is approachable with
Yeah.
doubt. I wrote a blog post just last week on the question of doubt, and the title was Gen D. We have all these different generations that accumulate labels, and some of the stats have shown just the rise in religious doubt amongst more recent generations, Gen Z and millennials like myself. And so I think in terms of how I approach it is I think the kinds of people we are and the way we speak and the way we lead and the way we teach give signals to our students and to our parishioners on whether or not we are the kinds of people who can be approached with doubts, or whether or not we're the kinds of pastors and leaders and teachers around whom those doubts need to be sort of hidden or repressed or denied. And so by writing about it and by acknowledging the struggle with doubt that's there, I think, for most modern people, Jamie Smith says we're all Thomas now, that to be modern is to wrestle with the claims of secularism, of doubt, so to be approachable by the way we speak and the posture that we adopt with those questions, I think is important. And then I think secondly, to say to our students and to our parishioners that to be wrestling with doubt is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be something that God uses to refine us and to mature us and to transform us. But it matters how we wrestle. And you have to wrestle well. You have to actually desire an encounter with Christ rather than just a voicing of complaints and deconstruction as a kind of destination in and of itself. And so those are the two of the things that I talk about with students. Well, one, more just being approachable, and then second, having conversations about what it looks like to wrestle well through a season of doubt, however long that might be.
Well, that's really important. I've been in some of those conversations too, and I think sometimes somebody who just is able to walk and say, okay, it's all right to do this. It's all right to be going through this, and here's what it looks like to do this well. I think really matters. You use Abraham as an example of perhapsing. And you use a passage that I have found probably one of the ones that I have wrestled the most with, in my own Bible study and in teaching. And that's Genesis 22, Abraham's promised a son, Isaac, and then commanded by God to sacrifice this promised son. And we don't see Abraham arguing with God. He just goes and he prepares to do it. And God stops him. You bring in the idea of perhaps into your discussion of what might have been going on with Abraham. And you also engage Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. We have another guy on the call here who, with me, was actually involved in a discussion group on Fear and Trembling some years ago. So I'm very intrigued in how you think about Abraham's perhaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a passage that I think just no matter how much you study it, the rough edges don't get sanded off. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And I probably should express a little fear and trembling on being on a call with someone who's maybe a scholar on fear and trembling, lest my interpretation isn't the best.
I won't profess that by any means.
But there's a few things in the passage that I think can be helpful. I think it's Christopher Hitchens, the great, atheist, who claims that he basically derides the text as saying Christians, Jews, and Muslims all exalt in some way. They have some version of the Akedah, and they basically venerate this old man who was willing to listen to voices that told him to kill his son. And if somebody did that today, we would say that they were paranoid schizophrenic. We would not venerate the activity. And I sort of empathize with that reading, because I probably would be my reading if I was approaching the text, for the first time as a modern secular person. But there's some things in it, I think, that can help us to grasp why it's not a completely, just horrific thing. One is that Abraham has come to know this voice. Hitchens is wrong. He's not listening to voices. He has come to know this particular voice as faithful and trustworthy. It's the voice that spoke to him and brought forth life out of a dead womb and out of a shriveled up old man, and so he's come to know this voice. And secondly, Abraham lives in a culture where it's not completely inexplicable that the gods might demand things from us in terms of sacrifice that seem quite, just unfathomable to modern people. But then thirdly, in addition to those two things, I think the real help for me with the Akedah, the Genesis 22 passage, comes from the book of Hebrews. And Kierkegaard has this line in Fear and Trembling where he says, if only I knew Hebrew, then I might be able to sort of, unpack the mystery of this text. And so I sort of a play on words a bit. I say, I don't know that Hebrew, the language, would have helped him, but the book of Hebrews does have something to add. And that is where it speaks about Abraham, that he reasoned, that he logisomenos, he reasoned or he reckoned that God could even raise the dead, and that was sort of the ground for his obedient action, even in the face of this seemingly absurd or terrible command. And so one of the things I argue in the book is that when it says that he reasoned or reckoned or considered, we have different English translations, what he was really doing was the practice of perhapsing. Perhaps God can even raise this son of mine from the dead, from the ash heap. And it turns out that he's not quite right in that speculation, because God doesn't have to raise up Isaac from the ash heap, but it is still pointing forward to a resurrection of the beloved son, Jesus. And so his sort of faithful speculation is used by God to bring forth obedience, even in the face of high demands, even in the face of this seemingly, horrific command to offer up his son. And so I key in on the book of Hebrews there, and the logisomenos of Abraham, where he reckons or considers what may happen so that God can prove faithful to his promise to bring forth descendants, even in the wake of this apparent sacrifice.
Well, that is a helpful explanation. It's probably lines up, I know, with some of the ways I've wrestled with that passage. It's a tough one, though. I find for most people, if I'm reading through Genesis with people, it's like, hey, we got to stop and talk about this one. So thanks for talking about it some.
You're welcome.
Well, last question before we take a break and talk about your book a little bit. Through the book, you not only reference theologians like Augustine and Origen and Edwards and others, but you also talk about a lot of fiction writers, Cormac McCarthy, Steinbeck, Marilyn Robinson, and so forth. And why do you think both of those, both the theologians and the writers of fiction, are important to the practice of perhaps?
Yeah, I think one thing is that, form has to match content. And if we're talking about a sanctified imagination, then we can't just dwell in the realm of sort of rationality or sort of nonfiction. I think one of the ways that Christians can be sort of compelled or drawn, or even just doubters towards the truth of the gospel, is by virtue of the beauty of the gospel. And so we need to reclaim art, and we need to reclaim things like literature as pointers toward divine truth. And even in sources that might seem a little bit unlikely, and Cormac McCarthy might be one. He's not exactly, often considered to be a Christian novelist. But I think there's an extent to which our apologetics needs to reclaim the arts, beauty, as well as attention to evidence and rationality. And so that's part of it's just because I love literature. I love fiction. And I think as a preacher, we have to develop sensibilities towards the aesthetic and the imaginative, as well as delving into exegesis and things like that. So those are some reasons why I try to weave in a lot of fiction. And even I even wrote, there's a fictional narrative that weaves through the book about a young lady named Eliza who goes off to a Christian college and begins to sort of lose her faith. And she's disillusioned, like many of my students are, with the culture in which we live and the contentious discourse. And so there's even I'm not claiming to have written as good a fiction as any of the authors you mentioned, but there's even a fictional narrative that weaves its way through the book between the chapters.
That was one of the parts I enjoyed the most, actually. It was a good, you give us a good breather that periodically. You do some heavy lifting with ideas, and then you give us a breather with story. And so it almost seems like you're doing what you advocate in some ways. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, hey, speaking of the book, we got to talk about it a little bit. And so, because actually, the book is just the book is coming out shortly. Let me get back to the slide there. Yeah, the book formally launches, I think, in September, but I believe you can already order it at the InterVarsity Press's website, and we have a deal where you can order that at a 40% discount using the code GFMWeb21. And we'll put that in the chat along with the link for the book, which is just ivpress.com/perhaps. And we'd encourage you to, if what you've heard today sounds interesting, I think this has just been a kind of a snippet or a preview of the full treatment that is in this is in perhaps. So I really enjoyed getting into the book myself. So at any rate, and with that, we have some time for some Q&A here. And I don't see anything in the chat yet. And let me just go ahead and put that link and discount code into the chat here for us. And while I'm doing that, if you have some questions for Josh, I think he would really enjoy hearing from you. And you're also welcome you're welcome, if you'd like, to use the raise hand function under reactions and unmute yourself when I call on you. So I'll keep an eye out for people who would like to talk. And Christina has a question. Is the idea of perhaps to be extended toward all truth, say with respect to the Bible being the Word of God, are we certain about this? Or is there some tentativeness associated with it? That's a great question. Thanks, Christina.
That's a good question. And I think, clearly there are people who would probably still identify as Christians, but they would extend this perhapsing to any number of truth claims that maybe I wouldn't extend it to. And I go into that a fair bit in the introduction of the book. And so I try to distinguish the way I'm using the word from what I call just mere what-ifery. Maybe you just sort of venture forth this completely sort of off the wall. Maybe the earth really does sit on the back of, a tortoise that sits on the back of another tortoise, that, that sort of
it doesn't.
Rampant speculation. Although there is a tortoise in this fictional vignette I had to put in for my 4-year-old son. So that's one of the ways I would distinguish my usage of the term from what I might say is just sort of what-ifery run amok. But I also talk about how that I locate myself within the really broad hall of Christian orthodoxy, and there's a lot of diversity in that hall. but because of my own encounter with God and my convictions about the scripture, there are certain questions that I'm not endlessly rehearsing. What if God isn't love? And I may still struggle with doubt in certain seasons, maybe struggle more mightily than others. It's not that I try to repress all of those questions, but I'm also, this book also is not an act of sort of rampant revisionism, trying to call into question core claims of Christianity, like maybe some other books that would be located more within the deconstruction camp, which what I would be a little bit different from. I hope
Mhm.
that answers the question.
Yeah. Jeff has a question. He said, are there indicators that you're seeing in your research regarding activation of faith among current generations, especially as it relates to mission work?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not. Uh, one of the things that I say that I'm not doing in this book too much is really delving into statistics a lot about this generation and different generations. I'm not an expert on some of those generational shifts statistically, like somebody like Ryan Burge, who deals with the nuns and statistics amongst Gen Z and millennials. So I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on the activation of faith, statistically speaking, in the current generations. I do see a lot of, just anecdotally, my students are kind of fed up with some of the divides within evangelicalism and the polarization and the split that I have described between angry dogmatism and crippling doubt, and they want a better way. They want something other than that. I've been a little bit sad, just to be honest. In our department here, our numbers of students coming in as freshmen who want to be missionaries. You mentioned missions work. Uh, Jeff did. Our numbers are down a little bit in terms of students coming in saying, I want to be a missionary. I don't know entirely what to make of that, as these students are coming through youth groups or evangelical churches, or, just churches, period. It does seem, just anecdotally, that I've seen slightly fewer students who are saying, hey, I'm called to missions work cross culturally, for whatever that is worth.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, David raises the question of, do you think that your practice of perhaps has application to political conversations, especially among believers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think that's one of the areas where we see most obviously this trend towards dogmatism and the demonizing of our opponents and angry, simplistic claims. Um, in the guardrails chapter, I set forth kind of some commandments on how to say perhaps without sort of falling off a cliff. And one of those is something that I borrowed from Jonathan Edwards, and that is the seeking of what I call, and this is not unique to me, seeking non-contrastive solutions. And Edwards sort of famously brings together the glorification of God with the happiness or the fulfillment of the believer. And, John Piper kind of famously popularizes that in the claim that, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. But basically, going back to Edwards, it's the idea that those two things don't need to be pitted against each other. God receiving maximal glorification and the believer being fulfilled or blessed or happy in God, that they actually intersect. And so that's just an example of a non-contrastive solution. And I think when we talk about politics, to come back to the question, Christians need to be seeking out some non-contrastive solutions where it doesn't have to always be this side is always right and that side is always wrong. And, I'm just going to carry water for whatever talk radio host or cable news network that I listen to, and I'm going to repeat all their talking points. We need to reclaim a little bit of nuance and charity and seek out some common ground on some of these issues. And so that's where perhaps I think one of the guardrails comes in, or one of the commandments about seeking out non-contrastive solutions.
Okay. Christina, I think maybe some of us are in this camp, is trying to understand this idea of perhaps. Could you define certainty? Is certainty not different from certitude? According to the scriptures, we have assurance. How would you differentiate this assurance from certainty?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have a whole chapter in there where I basically define what I mean by dogmatism. And a part of that is this kind of false, so I call it false certainty. So to answer the question specifically, though, I use those two words, certitude and certainty, as basically synonymous. I think I've kind of referred to both of them even in this conversation. But I differentiate what I would call a dogmatic certitude from assurance. I do think the scriptures talk about us having an assurance of, say, our salvation, or they talk about us knowing God. There's a kind of knowing that we can have. And so I go through a whole bunch of scriptures that seem to say that, yeah, we can have this assurance. But then I differentiate that from what I would call a kind of epistemic or rational claim to absolute certainty. And so I break down kind of some, if you could call it this way, kind of some different species of certainty, and try to say, here's what I'm talking about as something that we probably can't have, this sort of mathematical, logical certainty. But we can have assurance, but it's something different than the kind of thing you have with sort of logical syllogisms or mathematical proofs. If we're looking for something like that, then I don't think we're going to be satisfied with the Christian life.
Yeah. It seems like sometimes the challenge, isn't it, is that some people want to have certitudes or certainty about everything. That somehow, if Christ is true, everything must be certain. And it's the question. It's the difference between do I trust that Jesus is true versus do I know the truth about all things? It seems.
Yeah, and that posture, I think it may have something to do with René Descartes and probably a whole other host of thinkers, but not very much to do with the scriptures.
Yeah. Peter's raised his hand and has something he wants to bring up. Peter, go ahead and unmute. And
yeah, I just thought I'd try to articulate this orally rather than write it down. Do you think that, Josh, deconstruction, because you mentioned this, and it is a cultural pattern that we're seeing now, could be a way to get us from certitude to faith, insofar as it can be a way to remove idols, and a way to die to the false self, a way to enter into our baptism and rise again in new life in Christ. And so it doesn't have necessarily this negative connotation of just being doubt, of Christ's work for us in bringing us to God, but a process of removing idols.
Yeah, I think it can be. I interact a little bit with Greg Boyd. I believe I'm getting my sources mixed up, but I think he has a book called The Sin of Certainty, or that might be Peter Enns. They both have books on certainty. One of them is called The Sin of Certainty. And it's basically making the claim that sometimes certainty can be an idol that needs to be shattered in our lives. And I think that can be true. And it has been true for certain people, especially coming out of kind of rigid backgrounds, that idol needs to be shattered. And so that deconstruction can serve a noble and helpful purpose there. And so just like I try to differentiate between different species of certainty, I also want to differentiate between different species of doubt or deconstruction. And so I delve into, well, then it seems to me, and just to kind of shift gears a little bit, a lot of the books on this topic, because there has been this overemphasis on certainty and proof, are a lot of the books on the topic are trying to sort of say, well, wait, doubt's not necessarily bad. And that's true. I agree with that. But when you look at how the scriptures speak of doubt, it's almost always something that God is working against. And I go through a bunch of different biblical passages. So in answer to your question, I think deconstruction can be necessary. Certainty can be an idol. And so there's a salutary place for that. However, like I said earlier, I think it matters how we wrestle with our doubts and the way in which we move through that season of deconstruction. Because like I said, I don't want deconstruction to be seen as a kind of destination or as this sort of just continual posture of critique that never really lands in the realm of Christian faith or trust or obedience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there has to be some reconstruction, right? You can't live nowhere, or you can't be in the desert forever.
Yeah.
It's got to be a journey towards something. Yeah.
And I think this is A.J. Swoboda talks about this in his book on doubt, and I agree. Doubt has often been demonized and valorized, but we have to find this kind of third option because the scriptures don't approach it in either one of those two kind of extreme ways, or if we read them rightly.
Thanks.
Okay. Christina, you have some great questions that you've been posing today. In one of your statements, you mentioned about perhaps being a posture of those who have big questions toward Christian Orthodox truths. To begin by giving it a thought of what if? Is it like a Pascal's wager sort of approach to faith? Is this presented as an option for those who struggle with doubts, or presented as the right way or the only right way to faith? When you mention about certainty, are you referring to articulatable logical statements? For Michael Polanyi's understanding of epistemology, in my opinion, allows us to have the certain assurance without defining it with merely pure objective logic.
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't really interact with Pascal or Polanyi in the book. I'm trying to think if they're even in a footnote necessarily. Like I said, I do think that we can have assurance without defining it in terms of pure objective logic. And so I agree with Polanyi there. I think that's an important sort of differentiation, like I said, between different species of knowing or certitude. I don't use the term certitude, but to come back to your first kind of the first part of your question, you say in one of your statements you mentioned about perhaps being a posture of those who have big questions moving towards Orthodox Christian truths. So at the end of the book, I engage in kind of 3 case studies where I say, here's 3 big issues, big questions within the kind of realm of Christian thought in the world in which we live. How might sacred speculation speak into these big questions? And so the first one of those case studies is I'm looking at kind of one of the haunting questions of Charles Darwin when he pondered just the eons and eons of animal death and suffering that he felt like was required to get us to this point. And he says it in one of his letters that just almost endless ages of almost endless suffering seems contradictory to a God or a creator of benevolence. That I can't imagine that a benevolent creator would design or allow that. And obviously I don't have the quote in front of me, so I'm just kind of summarizing Darwin's, sort of doubt, so to speak. And so the chapter is really looking at an objection from the realm of science and the question of death before the fall, animal suffering, and the goodness of God. And I'm not venturing forth any sort of like, here's my conclusion, I'm not a scientist, but I'm basically saying, well, if we were to think sort of within the realm of Christian orthodoxy, but also taking seriously science, are there ways in which we could say perhaps that would offer some help to Darwin's dilemma there regarding animal suffering long before the arrival of humans on the scene, so to speak? So those case studies, all of that to kind of lead up to this point, those case studies are my attempt to show how you might utilize this posture to sort of reach towards orthodox truth, specifically that first one that deals with an objection from science, even though I'm not offering the one definitive answer to sort of animal suffering before the fall. It's a way to try to model that approach in a particular way, in a particular ethical or particular theological question, rather.
Peter, Christina says, thank you so much for entertaining so many questions for me and answering them. Definitely an important topic to ponder about. Christina, thank you so much for your questions and for being part of this today.
Yeah,
Peter, you had something else I think you wanted to jump in on.
No, I hadn't yet. I don't know why my hand is still up.
Okay.
Let me see if I can get it down.
Oh, okay. I thought you might wanted to come back there. Okay. Anybody else who wants to jump into the conversation? Well, maybe as we move toward the close of our call, Josh, if you had some parting thoughts that maybe you'd like to share, and I'd be particularly interested in how maybe you could address a little bit in that your thoughts about some of the directions you think the church might need to go, particularly with our current generation of youth and some of the struggles they have of moving away from dogmatism and toward doubt, and how the church might engage that.
Yeah, I want the book to serve the church, and I talk about in the very beginning this split that I see. The split between the ministry students or the students I teach in my college environment, and sometimes the evangelical parishioners that I preach to on a Sunday morning, especially that belong to a very different generation, and how the two groups they just they're not seeing the world in the same way. And so I think the church, the tendency sometimes is to just sort of cater to the base. And sometimes that means to just sort of play the music to the song that the people who are you're giving the money like to hear. And there's some really obvious reasons for that. Is like, if you don't, you might lose your job, or you might have to deal with a mess or an angry email, or people might leave and go somewhere else. But I think that the church is going to have to be willing to refuse to be shoved into kind of one of the little tribal boxes that our culture loves to set forth. And that could be refusing to be pigeonholed on either the far right or the left, refusing to be sort of just shoved into the little sort of tribal niches that our culture sets forth. And that's going to be hard. It's going to mean that pastors have to say things that might not always, be popular. But I think if we don't do that, we're going to continue to lose the younger generation in the process, or will ultimately the church will become sort of less meaningful to them, because they see that it's just sort of parroting things in the culture that are not life-giving.
Well, I really appreciate that. I was in a conversation with a university president who was talking about what he saw as the sort of approaching mental health crisis that's arising out of the pandemic with entering college students. And one of his comments was that he thought that a lot of those students would not turn to religious groups or institutional Christianity for help. They might turn to professors. And I thought it was a saddening comment to me in some ways, to realize that that many of these places that oftentimes people would turn to in the past are not trusted by some of our entering students. And yet at the same time, it suggests that the work that you do and the work that others on this call who are faculty or graduate students you might occupy an important place with students who are wrestling with tough questions. Well, we want to one more time mention the book and encourage people to pick up a copy. Here's the information again. The book is called Perhaps, and you can pick it up at a 40% discount. This might even be a great thing to pick up for somebody who was not able to join today's conversation to share with, or even to discuss as a group. At the checkout, you can use the code GFM Web 21, and you'll get a 40% discount on the book at InterVarsity Press. We also want to let you know about next month's conversation. We're still in the process of firming up details about that, so watch your email about the for information about the conversation. But we're looking forward to hosting Robert Tracy McKenzie, who has a book coming out called We the Fallen People. And Mackenzie explores some of the questions that we're facing about the future of democracy. He argues in the book that we are fallen people. He argues that the founders of the country actually assumed human fallenness in their politics, but with the rise of inherent human goodness, he sees a certain peril to democracy. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating conversation. So watch your email or ESN social media for the date and time and sign up information for our next call. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you all for your questions. I think we've had really appreciated the conversation. Want to thank Josh for taking the time to be with us as he gets ready for a busy book launch time and a new semester at the same time. And I want to thank InterVarsity Press, who has worked with us in arranging and setting up these conversations and providing the generous discount on the books that we feature. Finally, I just want to mention the Emerging Scholars Network. We are an effort of InterVarsities to assist aspiring scholars all along the pathway from undergraduates to early career faculty who are wondering, can I do this work of scholarship as a Christian? And we provide a number of resources on our blog, our social media, online conversations like this and panels. And And so we would invite you to join the Emerging Scholars Network if you have not already. Membership is free. You just go to our blog.emergingscholars.org, and you can click on the Join Today button, and there's a short form to fill out. There's no cost to that. We're also in the midst of working on some benefits for actually being an ESN member, some discounts and some things like that that are going to be fun. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESN IVCF. And this conversation and conversations we've recorded over the last year or so are available on our YouTube channel that's easily accessible at tinyurl.com/ESN YouTube. So with that, I want to thank everybody, and we will conclude the recording and unmute, and you're welcome to unmute and stick around and talk for a few more minutes.